Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crime Grows Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if Britain had lost the Falklands? So within this video, as always, we're going to give a little bit of the context because it's a complicated issue, very contentious. If you ever have met any Argentinians and mentioned the Falklands, they'll be like, no, it's the Malvinas, and yeah, that's just an endless conversation. More like an argument, but anyway, I've had plenty of those before. But anyway, so in this video we're going to go through a lot of the lengths to explain the history of the Falklands prior to this conflict. And I'll say conflict, if I say war, just replace that with the word conflict, because it's not actually technically a war, it's a conflict because less than 1,000 people died. So by the definition of war, it's not a war. So anyway, so anytime you see like where it says like the Falklands War, it's meant to be the Falklands conflict. But anyway, so I'm going to go through some of the history of that, and then we're eventually going to get on to the alternative history scenario. So yeah, basically stay tuned for that. So the Falklands, unlike many contested places, right, prior to European explorers, there was no indigenous population, right? So the islands were uninhabited, yeah, up until 1690, right? So the first undisputed landing on the islands was by the English captain, John Strong. So yeah, so he landed there in 1690, but islands remained uninhabited until 1764, at which point the French landed. And they landed on East Falklands, and they set up a base there. And then the British end up landing in Saunders Island in 1766, and they set up Fort Egmont. So that's basically kind of where they were based. However, in 1766, the French surrendered their claim to the islands to the Spanish, because the Spanish were the ones who controlled that general region before then, right? So the Spanish end up taking Port Egmont in 1770. However, the British end up returning in 1771. And the British voluntarily left in 1774. At which point the islands were handed over to the Spanish viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, right? So again, it wasn't, so it was part of like the Spanish Empire, but yeah, so no Argentina yet. I'm just making this point. Now, as we discussed last time in our video about the Napoleonic Wars, right? Spain ended up being invaded by France, and so as a result, it led to a lot of instability within the Spanish Empire, and so this led to the South American Wars of Independence, right? So during that time, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata end up gaining its independence, but also during this time the British end up landing on the actual mainland itself, so around Buenos Aires and around what is today Uruguay. They tried to basically take that over from the Spanish, and in the same way as they'd taken South Africa from the Dutch, right? So that's basically what they tried to do. However, this ended up being unsuccessful, so the British end up returning back to their base in South Africa, right? And during this invasion, they also seized the Falklands, right? So the governor of the island ended up being evacuated in 1806, and then 5 years later in 1811, the garrison ended up leaving as well. So the only people who were left on the Falklands were the gauchos, who were basically South American cowboys, and a few fishermen, right? So that was all that was kind of left and stuff, right? And again, during this time, it wasn't really like much really going on. So as we discussed in that last video, we were talking about Napoleon. So the Rio de la Plata end up getting its independence, and obviously there to fight a long war for its independence, right? So it was from 1810 to 1816, and what came out of that was the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. So a little bit after this, the Americans end up sending a warship down there, which was the USS Lexington in 1831, and they end up dissolving the governance of that island. So they said, right, so the Rio de la Plata no longer controls this area. So at this point, no one really had any real claim on it. So the British in 1833 came to the island, and they've been there ever since. Well, apart from during like the Falklands conflict and stuff, right? So that's basically Britain's claim. So they've been controlling the islands pretty much continuously from 1833 onwards. Now you might ask, why are you telling me all this just useless information and stuff, right? Well, the reason for that, and it was very, very tedious, believe me, it was difficult to film, because I had to be like, wait, who did what in what year and who landed, but it's really, really tedious. However, I told you all that just to give a bit of context of saying basically that the Argentine claim is not really as straightforward as they make out. Like they try and make it out like, oh, like this is, you stole like sovereign Argentine territory and stuff and we want it back. No, not at all. And also as well, Argentina didn't even exist at that point. So as I said, it's the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. The Argentine Confederacy wasn't established until 1835, right? And then like the actual Argentina itself came a few decades later. So they're making this claim because of the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. But the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, which is quite a mouthful to say, that included Argentina, it included Bolivia, it included Uruguay, and also included large parts of Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile, right? So if you're going to make those claims that you own the island because the United Provinces owned that, why are you not also claiming all these other places, right? The reason for that is because they know that they can get away with trying to claim the British one, in the Falklands, but they can't get away with that yet because they can paint this as being anti-colonialism, and like decolonization, but they can't like do it for all those other countries. That's the main reason. And unfortunately, that's why most countries in the world take the Argentine side, including most places in Latin America, with the exception of some notable ones, which we'll get onto a little bit later. So you might imagine, due to the rhetoric from Argentina nowadays, that throughout all this time, there was a bitter, like really tense relationship between Argentina and Britain. Not exactly. As a matter of fact, so Britain obviously had the largest empire the world had ever seen, but there was also something known as the informal empire, right? And this was a series of different places around the world where Britain didn't directly control, but it had a huge amount of influence in, and it had a lot of investments, right? And Argentina was the number one place within this so-called informal empire, right? So so a lot of the banking systems which were in place in Argentina was controlled by the British. They also forced free trade on the Argentinians because Argentina and most places in Latin America normally have like protectionist policies, and actually most places in the world tend to have protectionist policies, but it was the British in the mid-19th century who were pioneers of pushing free trade, because free trade is the reason why you have so much prosperity nowadays around the world, right? It's because it's better for the consumers, it's better for everyone to have free trade. Protectionism is basically putting a blockade on yourself. So it doesn't actually help. Like kind of there's the seen versus the unseen. It's long to explain with economics stuff, but whereas countries like Argentina would tend towards protectionism, Britain forced them to have free trade, and as a result they end up becoming substantially wealthy. So wealthy in fact that so in 1870 the GDP per capita in Argentina was roughly around 76% of what it was in Britain, right? So Britain was the richest country on earth in terms of GDP per capita, or maybe Switzerland or one other like place might have been a little bit higher at that time, but it was very, very high up. And by 1900 it ended up being 96% of what Britain's GDP per capita was, right? And this is a result of the amount of money being put in for railways and for banking and all these different things, and like for Argentinian agriculture, because obviously they exported a lot of beef to the empire, not the rest of the world. So all this was done kind of with the British putting in a lot of money and stuff, right? And actually, just to give an idea of just how much this is, and obviously you've got different sources. This is the whole thing with history. It's a debate. But according to a source, in 1890, 40% of Britain's overseas direct capital, end up going to Argentina, right? So all the money that Britain invested in different places around the world, it didn't go to Australia, didn't go to Canada, didn't go to India, didn't go to Africa. It went to Argentina, right? So a huge amount of money coming from Britain to Argentina to help prop up their economy. So this is the reason why Argentina at this time was one of the wealthiest countries in the whole world. So you'd think that the Argentinians, knowing all that, would be a little bit more kind of grateful and stuff. And actually a big reason why they're not doing so well now is kind of because they went in the opposite direction to that. And also Britain, unfortunately, went in the opposite direction to that. Because as a result of World War I and World War II, and obviously like the Depression, etc., countries like Britain and many other places around the world went the opposite way from free trade, and they decided to go more towards protectionism. So if you're a country which is very export dependent, like Argentina was, it meant that if no one wants to really buy your goods, then that's going to really hurt your economy, right? And on top of that, after World War II, you end up having Peron, who ended up taking over, right? So, a lot of Argentinians, still love him today, but he was basically a populist, and he basically blamed all of Argentina's problems on two things, right? One was the control of the Argentinian economy by foreign investors and stuff. So so the banks and all these different like kind of like industry and stuff, right? So what he ended up doing then was nationalizing a lot of things and end up redistributing a lot of the wealth. And the problem with redistributing wealth to too great of extent is that eventually you disincentivize the creation of new wealth. And on top of that, he stoked Argentinian nationalism, right? And one of the main things that he used to unite the Argentinian people was the Malvinas, which is actually the Falkland Islands, right? So on Argentinian maps, end up being a thing where it's like, right, Falklands, the Malvinas, they are Argentinian, right? And it's our national mission to retake these islands from the British here, these evil colonizers, yeah, look at these people. We need to take these islands back from them, and then we will have our restored glory and stuff, right? Now, neither of these policies really worked out for Argentina very well, and we can see this in the fact of when Peron eventually ended up leaving office and stuff. Well, he was overthrown in a coup. You end up having a military junta there, and the leader of this military junta was General Galtieri, right? So Galtieri and his minions, when they were running the Argentinian government, you end up having hyperinflation. So, during the time when the British were in control of it, one thing that the British were really, really opposed to and like were for nearly all of their like history and stuff, is having inflation. Like you don't want to have inflation too high of a level. You want to keep the currency stable, because then all the bad things that end up coming from inflation and stuff, like higher prices, etc., etc. So the British had Argentina on a very kind of like stable basis. However, as a result of the kind of Peronist reforms, you end up having hyperinflation. So by 1981, the inflation rate in Argentina was over 600%, right? And so, that means that if you earn $1 today, a year from now, you're going to need to have $600 to equate that same thing. And obviously the same thing with pounds as well, right? So you got £1 this year, you're going to need £600 the next year, which means that your savings are going to be wiped out unless you're incredibly wealthy, which means that the price of things are going up. If you're on a fixed income, it's not going to like keep up with the high rate of inflation. So people's savings, people's livelihoods completely ruined. So as a distraction to all that, they was like, right, we need to have a war. And the first place they went to try to have this war was not actually Britain, it was Chile, right? So that was the Latin American country, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, right? So first of all, they want to go to fight Chile, right? They want to take some islands, they want to take some land from the Chileans. However, this was stopped by the intervention of the Pope. So Pope John Paul II, he was like, right, you guys are both Catholics, please don't fight each other, let's just have peace and stuff, right? So as a result, the Argentinians were like, okay, cool, we won't attack another Catholic country. However, those damn British, we're gonna attack them. And so I was like, right, we're gonna, get all these troops, and we're gonna fight, and we're gonna, fight a bloody conflict and stuff, and we're gonna come out of it being victorious, and yes, we're gonna be a proud nation again. We're gonna have beaten the British Empire, right? However, what no one told the Argentinians is that most British people don't even know where the Falklands is, and so. Especially in 1982, people did not know where this thing was. They were like, huh? Where, what? Where's the Falklands been invaded? Where's that? And it also as well, like during this time, so you had the Thatcher government, and during that time they had made a bunch of budget cuts to like the Navy and stuff, and like just to the army in general. So they didn't expect there to be a war. So as a result, they only had a platoon who were defending the whole island, right? And Falklands, even nowadays, only has 3,000 people on it, right? And all it has is sheep and fish. Sheep and fish, right? So it's not very high on like, if the Falklands get taken, it's not, on the face of it, it's not like that existential. So as a result, the government was like, okay, yeah, we don't necessarily need to have that many people like defending this, right? So when the islands end up getting invaded, this ended up actually being a massive humiliation for Britain, because while in practice it's only a few islands, in principle it's the invasion of British sovereign territory by another country, right? Especially by a military dictatorship, right? So you can't really just let this thing slide. And so as a result, Margaret Thatcher sent a task force down to the Falklands to go and fight them, right? And over the 10-week conflict, remember I said conflict, not a war, over the course of 10 weeks, so they managed to get down to the islands, and obviously it was very difficult for them to retake the islands. They had to land there, but while they were landing, the Falklands are within a range of like the Argentinian Air Force from the mainland, so they're able to fly their jets over and attack like the ships and attack the men who are there and stuff. So it was very, very contentious and stuff. Like, there was many points at which it looked like it wouldn't like actually be successful. In particular, when they sunk two of the ships that were there, the Sheffield and can't remember what the other one was, but I'll have it on screen now. And then also as well, as we kind of made the point as well, the rest of the world, took the Argentinian side, right? So that it's alleged, like kind of like we don't fully know the ins and outs of it yet, but it's alleged that even the Soviet Union, had a part to play in this, like they helped the Argentinians out, and the sinking of those two ships, it's not fully confirmed, but the Soviets may have played some sort of like a part in that, right? So the whole rest of the world was against us, and even like American stuff, they wanted to be on the good side of like Latin American countries, especially during like the Cold War and the fight against communism. So they was like, we can't come out too strongly against this, right? And also something to note as well is that NATO, Article 5 of NATO, I think I've got the right one, it says that an attack on one is an attack on all. So you'd expect, the whole of like NATO to actually come to Britain's defence, but they didn't. And neither did like the Commonwealth. New Zealand helped us out a bit apparently, but other than that, no one actually came to help. So it was all on Britain. The stakes were very high, and if we had failed, then it would have been on us, right? So with regard to this conflict, basically the what if is what would have happened if the task force had ended up being sunk, right? And what I'm going to use as the pivot for this what if is the most controversial point of this whole conflict. So within this conflict, in which about 950 people end up being killed, the single largest event, which caused like the greatest number of fatalities, was the sinking of the Belgrano, right? So over 600 Argentinian sailors end up being killed with the sinking of the Belgrano. So the Belgrano, as far as I'm aware from memory, it had been previously a kind of a US warship during like the World War II era, which had been given out to Argentina. So basically, as we can see on the map here, right? So the British, very nicely, never ever have heard of this in any other kind of like war before. They set up a 200-mile exclusion zone, right? There had been originally plans to invade Argentina. This was Operation Mikado, but this got scrapped because they were like, right, let's try and limit this war. And the 200-mile exclusion zone around the islands, that was kind of seen as a thing of, right, let's limit it. So any Argentinian ship which we see within this zone is fair game, but any ship outside of it, we won't attack, right? So in no other wars this ever happened, as far as I'm aware, but we did it nonetheless, right? So the Belgrano happened to be outside of this 200-mile exclusion zone. And as you can see on the map here, it does a kind of squiggly line just around outside the perimeter, right? However, what couldn't be said at the time to the public, and this is kind of what caused a lot of controversy, is that the British knew that the Belgrano had the capability to sink the ships there, right? So we had the aircraft carrier and we had some other ships there as well. And if, say, for instance, the aircraft carrier got taken out, then that would have meant that, Argentinian air support would have been completely uncontested, and, it would have been absolutely devastating. And also as well, the Argentinians did their invasion at a time of year in which they knew it'd be almost impossible past a certain date for the British to send another task force. So the South Atlantic at that time of year is very, the water is very, very choppy, and so basically if this invasion had not succeeded, they would have had to wait a whole nother year to send a different fleet down there, right? And the humiliation would have just been astronomical, right? So the pivot within this alternative history is basically saying, what if the Belgrano was never sunk, right? And it had been allowed to go around and go and take out the task force. So that's basically what the alternative history is. So first of all, the most obvious thing is that if Argentina had succeeded in this, it would have really boosted their sense of national pride. The government there, the military junta, would have been, it would have been praised to the rafters by the people of Argentina. Actually, as a consequence of them losing the war, the military junta there ended up being overthrown. So Argentina, for quite some time afterwards, probably would have still had like a military junta running the country. So, you know, yeah, you're welcome, Argentina. By us defeating you, you end up getting democracy as a result of it, yeah, which you probably wouldn't have got as early as you did otherwise, right? But on top of that, you know, they would have been emboldened and they would be like, right, we've taken Falklands, now we are going to go after Chile, right? And this was a big fear, and actually they were quite open about it. And that's why Chile actually helped Britain during this time. So it's been disclosed now, many, many years later, but Chile actually played a huge part in helping Britain. So with like reconnaissance, you know, they allowed certain Chilean islands to be used by the British, like RAF, to do like reconnaissance missions, etc. And, you know, and gave like intelligence to the British, because they fully understood that if they managed to take the Falklands, then Chile is next, right? So this is why a few years later, yeah, so 1998, I believe, General Pinochet came to visit Britain, and there was all this kind of debate about, oh, should we lock him up because he's a criminal and stuff, and etc., etc. And Margaret Thatcher came out and defended him and said, no, he's been a good ally to Britain. And at the time, she couldn't explain why he'd been a good ally to Britain, but it's now come out that, you know, he helped out quite a lot. So as horrible as he was and stuff, yeah, he helped us, you know, basically one military junta ended up helping us defeat another military junta. That's basically the way to kind of think about it, right? But on top of that, the whole rest of the world, yeah, all the different dictators around the world would be like, right, you know, this has been allowed to happen and no one's done anything, right? So if you know, if they can get away with attacking Britain like this, then what's to stop us from taking whatever territory we want? Because the Americans aren't going to jump in, no one else is going to jump in. It's basically a free-for-all, right? So what ended up happening like a few years later with like, the Gulf War, right? So Saddam Hussein obviously invades Kuwait. We've covered that in a different video as well. Definitely check that out. So basically that war there, America and the other countries wouldn't have really had much of a leg to stand on yet, because it'd be like, hold on, you allowed Britain to end up having its territory taken from it. Why are you now concerned about Kuwaiti sovereignty, right? So, and Britain more likely not would have been like, well, you didn't help us, we're not helping in that. So, you know, Britain played a big part in the first Gulf War. So if they hadn't been helped in this conflict, then more likely than not, they wouldn't have actually like taken part in that. And it would have really like soured relationships, yeah, across like, the Western world. And this would have had ramifications, not just obviously like for Britain, yeah, who was already suffering from like post-Suez syndrome. So because we'd been humiliated by the Americans in the Suez crisis, where like, you know, the Americans said, no, you can't like intervene and like retake the Suez Canal. This basically humiliated Britain and led to a big period of decolonization where we end up having to give away all of our colonies. So Britain's stance in the world in 1982 was already quite low. We've already been hit with like a lot of unemployment and like inflation and just general stagnation and stuff, right? We were already kind of referred to as the sick man of Europe during this time. So if all this had been able to happen and we hadn't defeated the Argentinians, then it would have really like sunk like the national spirit, and like we would have been like really humiliated, and it would have, you know, the ramification of this would have probably gone on for quite some time. And then of course there's the fact that Margaret Thatcher, more likely than not, would no longer have been Prime Minister, right? So Margaret Thatcher, the so-called Iron Lady, as the Soviets dubbed her, right? She was a very, very tough leader and stuff. And, you know, she went on to win the 1983 election, then won the 1987 general election as well. Check out the film The Iron Lady, right? Yeah, whether you like her or hate her, or, you know, she's a bit like Marmite, people either love her or hate her. She played a really pivotal role, both in Britain and in the rest of the world, right? So for instance, yeah, her close relationship with Reagan, you know, and this at a time during the Cold War, where Reagan's really, really anti-Soviet, and he's really like, oh, I can't trust any of the Soviet leaders, yeah? Mikhail Gorbachev ends up taking over. So she ends up having a word with, well, first of all, she meets Gorbachev, of course, yeah, realizes, you know, susses him up, and then speaks to Reagan and says, this is someone we can do business with, right? So all of the kind of peace talks that end up happening as a result of like, you know, like the end of the Cold War and eventually the you know, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, etc., you know, all of that was sped up by the premiership of Margaret Thatcher, right? Because if she hadn't done that, it's not to say that these things wouldn't have happened anyway, but she certainly played a hand in speeding up that process, right? And then on a domestic front, would the Conservatives necessarily have won, like, you know, in the election of like, you know, 1983? It's debatable. I mean, if you look at Suez, which on the face of it was a much larger disaster, you know, like the Conservatives end up winning in the 1959 election. So there's a slight chance if they'd got rid of Thatcher and replaced with someone more moderate, maybe they might have won it, especially because the competition was just abysmal and stuff, right? I think maybe that might have been a reason why the Conservatives might have ended up winning. However, just taken as a face value, right? If we look at the opinion polls that happened before the Falklands War, because people often talk about how the Falklands War kind of gave like Thatcher a boost, yeah, like she won the election because of that war. But it's something to note that in the poll that was taken just before the war, the Conservatives were at 35%, Labour was at 30%, and the SDP Liberal Alliance, right, which was the kind of a new party at that time. It was basically a merger between the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, with the Liberals, and this eventually ended up becoming the Lib Dems. So this party here ended up getting 33% of the vote. However, as a result of our completely broken electoral system, right, the Conservatives would have got 296 seats. So if we freeze this in time for over a year, yeah, they would have got 296 seats. Labour would have got 255 seats, and the SDP Alliance, they would have got 74. So yeah, this shows just how, so they get 3% more votes, and yet they end up with only 74 seats. But anyway, so what more likely than not would have happened is that there would have ended up being a Labour, SDP, Liberal Alliance coalition. So there's technically almost three parties being in coalition together, right? And this would not have gone very well, because the thing is, the SDP, they end up being people who had left the Labour Party because Michael Foot had made the party like too radical and made it like just far too like left wing and stuff, right? So they had left that party for a reason. So why would they now be in coalition with them, right? And on top of that, and there's such of different policies, right? So whereas like SDP, you know, they liked some of like Thatcher's economic reforms, but they didn't like some of like they didn't want to go like the full like hog with it, right? At the same time, they also didn't like Labour's nationalisation platform, right? So it would have been difficult to have got any sort of like things done with this government, right? And you know, also as well, the fact that because these two parties had merged, I can't work out who would have been the leader amongst like the SDP, because you had, I believe, David Owens, and then you had Roy Jenkins. So in this time, I don't know who ends up being more senior, etc. And then Michael Foot, he just was, he was basically Corbyn for Corbyn. Yeah, like he was before Corbyn, he was like the most unpopular like Labour leader that you'd had since like the 1930s or something like that. Imagine him as like the Prime Minister and stuff, right? Most people would like, no, definitely not this guy. You know, so he would have gone from Thatcher like leading the country to Michael Foot and David Owen and Roy Jenkins all trying to negotiate some sort of thing. So it would have been realistically a complete disaster. And also as well, obviously, the following year in 1984, you end up having the miners' strike. Now, considering that the last Labour government was brought down by a bunch of different like union strikes and stuff, because the unions in those days had a great deal of like control over like the country. And more likely than not, the miners who went out on strike, which was an illegal strike, by the way, you know, it went against like the ballot that they'd already had. You know, so Arthur Scargill, he wanted to bring down the Thatcher government. That was his stated aim. And this is why Thatcher ended up saying him and his like supporters were like the enemy from within. So basically, it was very much like a kind of a showdown between the Thatcher government and between the miners. But eventually, after almost a year, Thatcher government ended up winning, and the miners end up having to go back to work and stuff, right? And also as well, those people, as we discussed in a previous video about like, you know, what if Churchill had won the 1945 election, going all the way back and stuff, we're looking at like nationalisation and the effect that it had. Eventually, these mines were going to be shut down anyway, and had been shut down since like the 50s onwards, right? So it's a steep decline downwards. So don't think that, oh yeah, we'd have like significantly more coal mines and stuff, especially in this new age of like low carbon emissions stuff. Eventually the mines would have been shut anyway, right? So that's kind of the thing to kind of like take into consideration, yeah, that Britain, like its stand in the world, would have been greatly weakened. Its leadership at home would have been missing, and yeah, basically dictatorships around the world would have been emboldened and been able to basically get away with doing whatever, because if they can get away with doing it to Britain, they can get away with doing it to anyone. So Hope that you liked this alternative history. If you did, definitely don't forget to hit the like button, share with your friends. Sharing is caring, as we always said. You know, like hit us up on Instagram as well. We've got merchandise which we have there. Also as well, we've got a link in the description for the Patreon if you want to support us there. It really helps out the channel. Like all these things really help out the channel because it's my full-time job. And yeah, so the next video, you're going to have a mixture of different choices, right? So you're going to have what if Biafra became independent? So all the ramifications of an independent African country, or like a breakaway African country, and what effect that would have had on other countries around Africa. And then the other choice is what if India and Pakistan never got partitioned and stuff, right? So we're doing a future video on that. So you know, let me know in the comment section which you'd prefer, and then I can start kind of making plans for that. Yeah. So in the meantime, have a great day and bye.